Okay, where are my Dodge guys? You guys should be excited. Today we got modifications to a small block Dodge, and it's a 360. It's not even a Magnum 360. It's an early LA 360. So stick with me. We got a whole bunch of modifications. I'll show you how to give your 360 the 1-2 punch. In this video, hang on, there's something missing. This, right over here. If you'll notice, that heavy bag is no longer there. That's because in the intro of this video, I hit that thing so hard, I knocked the bag down. That's right, recognize. Okay, maybe it had something to do with us leaving the bag out in the sun and the rain for years and years, but I'm totally taking all the credit. Okay, in this video, we took a look at a bunch of modifications I made to a Dodge 360. Now, this particular 360 kind of has a cool story because it was originally in a Dodge Tradesman, 1975 Dodge Tradesman van that I owned at the time. Now, what we did was we ran that thing on the chassis dyno, then took the motor out and ran it on the engine dyno. And I got a video up on that. If you haven't seen that video, check it out. It's cool stuff. It's right here. But this video is about the modifications I made to that Dodge 360 once we had it up on the engine dyno, and we made a ton of mods, and it's all the stuff that you guys would do if you had a 360 and you wanted to upgrade it. So we put it on the dyno and ran it basically as a stone stock 2-barrel with factory cast iron exhaust manifolds and the exhaust the way that it ran in the van. We then did a ton of upgrades to it. We did long tube headers, we did 2 different camshafts, we did ported heads, we did a couple of different induction systems. I mean, we did a ton of stuff to it to show what works and what doesn't. So let's find out what works on the Dodge 360, and also, heavy bag. Okay, Dodge guys, you guys have been asking for it, and this one's for you. And this is not even a Magnum motor. This is actually the earlier LA motor. This is a 360 2-barrel from a 1975 Dodge Tradesman van. 360 2-barrel. What I did was we actually had run it on the chassis dyno first, and then we installed it on the engine dyno so I could run a number of different modifications. So we installed it first on the engine dyno with the factory cast iron exhaust manifolds. We ran the stock exhaust that was in the van, which I think was a 2-inch exhaust, and stock exhaust manifolds. We also ran the stock 2-barrel induction system and the factory air filter assembly. I'll go ahead and show you a photo of that. We got that. So run on the engine dyno with, and including the mechanical water pump, if I remember right. So run in this manner on the engine dyno to get things started, to get this party started on our 360 testing. Our 2-barrel 360 produced 225 horsepower and 338 foot-pounds. And you notice we ran it all the way down to 2,000 RPM because this thing was not designed to make a lot of top-end power, at least not in stock configuration. This thing made peak power at 4,500 RPM and made peak torque at 2,900 RPM. So our first modification, we wanted to do what guys would normally do. So the first thing I did was basically just take that air filter assembly off, and as we found out, even though we weren't making hardly any power, and this was still a 2-barrel 360, that factory air cleaner was a little bit restrictive. So here's what happened: we took the factory air cleaner off, and we picked up a little bit of torque, a couple of foot-pounds. Peak torque checked in at 343 foot-pounds. And peak power checked in at 231 horsepower. So that was not a big significant gain, but it was nice to get rid of that factory air cleaner because it's huge, and it's a 2-barrel deal, so not ideal. So the first thing I did was I went to the junkyard and picked up a factory cast iron 4-barrel intake. A lot of the 360s came with 4-barrel induction systems. Mine was a base motor, so it didn't have that. So we put a 4-barrel, and what I wanted to put on there originally was, here I'll show you what the gains were, picked up a lot of power. What I originally wanted to do was pick up a factory 4-barrel induction system. When I went to the junkyard, I picked up a factory 4-barrel intake and a thermoquad that came from the factory with that 4-barrel induction system, but the thermoquad turned out to be no good, and I didn't have time to rebuild it, and having never rebuilt the thermoquad, I probably could have done it. But what we did instead was I found a good Quadrajet, and we just stuck a stuck a Quadrajet on there, and it worked very well. So here's what happened when we stuck the factory cast iron 4-barrel intake on there. Peak power jumped up to 264 horsepower. Peak torque was up to 359 foot-pounds. As you can see, we made peak torque a little bit farther out. Kind of had a little bit of a dual torque peak there. Made peak torque at 3,100. Peak power was all the way out at a whopping 4,700 RPM. And as we expected, the 4-barrel induction system made good power. And the nice thing I liked is it basically picked up power everywhere. We didn't lose anything, even down at 2,000 RPM compared to the 2-barrel. So now let's get to the rest of our modifications. Okay, we had already installed the factory Dodge 360 2-barrel with the factory air cleaner. Then removed the air cleaner and installed a 4-barrel and quadrajet induction system. So I've got the baseline and then the quadrajet system. So we were making 264 horsepower and 359 foot-pounds on. Here's what happened when we installed our next modification. What we did is replace the factory exhaust manifolds with long tube headers. These are 1 5/8 and they came from Hedman, and these were the elite headers. We actually asked for the low-cost ones, but they didn't have the low-buck ones. They only had the elite headers, but that worked out okay because they were really nice. So here's how much the headers add. And if we take a look down here, this is the thing that I want to talk to about headers is it's nice to have peak power gains, and we did get peak power gains. The thing made 277 horsepower. Peak torque was up to 373 foot-pounds. But take a look at the gain down here, like at 2,600 RPM. We had a big jump in torque. We went from 334 foot-pounds up to 364 foot-pounds. So it was a big jump in torque right there from the headers. And a lot of times long tube headers will do that. The extra scavenging offered by the long tubes picks up power down low, which is what we like. So now let's take a look at our next modification after running the headers. We started to get a little more serious. What I did was install a cam and cylinder heads. You know, just like always, we have limited time on the dyno sometimes, so I had to make both modifications at the same time. So we installed a set of factory ported heads, and they were just given a mild once over. It was not an extravagant affair here. All we did was go in and kind of clean up the bowls a little bit. Did a little fluffing on the entry and stuff. It was mostly just bowl work. And then we installed a small comp cam, kind of like an RV cam. And this is I think it's a 250 comp 252 cam. And I'll go ahead and put the specs up here for the 252 cam. It was mild, like I said, more like an RV deal. So this is what you do to upgrade a 360 if you're driving it around. This would be perfect in that Dodge Tradesman's van, or any kind of street or towing application. This would work really well. So the peak power output jumped to 339 horsepower. Peak torque was way up over 400 foot-pounds, 414 foot-pounds of torque. So now it's starting to be kind of a good combination, and we're up quite a bit from our original starting point of 224 horsepower. So let's take a look at our next modification. So after upgrading our Dodge 360 with heads and cam and a good induction system, we were making 339 horsepower and 414 foot-pounds of torque. We upgraded the induction system. So originally we had installed the factory 4-barrel intake manifold and a quadrajet. We replaced that with an Edelbrock RPM air gap and a small 650 Demon. And after installing that, we dialed it in. It made 342 horsepower and 428 foot-pounds of torque. You can see good gains through the middle here. Out at the very top, they were kind of the same. So we had a good induction system on there. Our next upgrade was to replace the factory shaft rockers with comp roller rockers. And those were definitely worth some power. Equipped with the comp rockers, power output jumped to 354 horsepower. Peak torque was 428 foot-pounds of torque, so the same. Just shifted it out a little bit. Most of the gains from the roller rockers came out at the top. And our final modification was actually a fairly big one. What we did was replace that small comp cam with a bigger 268 cam. And I'll go ahead and put the specs up here on the 268 cam. But here's what happened when we installed the bigger comp cam. Big power gains. Well, relatively big power gains for our 360. Power output jumped to 387 horsepower. Peak torque was up to 434 foot-pounds of torque. Made peak torque a little bit higher. And compared to the previous run with just the air gap intake and the smaller cam, we lost a little bit of torque below 3,600, but really not a ton, kind of only in this area between 3,100 and say 3,500. For the rest of it, they were kind of the same. So this 268 cam, it's a good street cam. It would work really well, allow the motor to rev out, fairly nice. I mean, all the way to 5,500 RPM. So this would be a good combination for a street 360. It would still be good even for the Dodge van. I actually ended up putting this motor back in the van with the smaller of the two cams. All I cared about as we were driving around. This thing never saw the high side of 4,500 RPM anyways, so the mild cam was still working really well. Let's get to our conclusion. This is one of those rare instances where I actually get to enjoy the motor after doing all the work to it on the engine dyno. So we would run it on the chassis dyno in stock trim before taking it out and putting it on the engine dyno. It made 155 or 156 horsepower at the wheels. And then we put it on the dyno, it made all the modifications. Now we went up fairly high and we installed that 268 cam stuff, but when I put it back in the car, when I put it back in the van, I actually put it back in the 345 horsepower combination. So we had a dual plate intake on there. I actually put a small Quadrajet carburetor in there, but we had the small cam in there also. So here's what happened, because we were just driving around. That van never saw the high side of 4,500 RPM. I really didn't need the extra cam. I was never going to put it to use. Here's what happened when we put the motor back in the van. As you can see, we got a big change in power. I mean, we picked up, basically 100 horsepower at the tire, which was quite a bit. Now, there might have been a little bit of loss down here, down low, but the van just felt a lot better. I mean, you could actually pass people and get on the freeway and do all the stuff that you're supposed to do when you actually have a motor. And the other good thing that I did that really helped out, that thing had a mechanical fan on it, a fan attached to the motor. And what we did was get rid of that and put an electric fan in, because every time you take off, that thing sounded like it was a plane taking off. I mean, every time you try to accelerate, it's like the propeller was going to chop the car in half. So we took out that mechanical fan, and I put electric fan on the thing, and the thing never overheated or anything. It worked out great, but it also picked up a little bit of power. So here's the combination after we put it back in the van. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, Dodge guys, what about it? Are you guys happy now that we've run a small block Dodge, a 360, even an LA motor, and not a Magnum motor? Because we don't like Magnum motors. Actually, I do, and I really want to run a Magnum, especially now that TrickFlow has new heads for that. I'd like to get a Magnum up on the dyno and run a series of tests with that too. But this LA motor worked very well. As a matter of fact, I was even able to take the motor in one particular configuration after we had it on the engine dyno, put it back in the vehicle and drive it around for quite a while. And I got to enjoy it, because if you saw the results of the chassis dyno numbers, having an extra 100 horsepower is always good, especially when it doesn't ruin drivability. I mean, because I drove that thing all the time. We didn't change anything with the converter or the rear end, did nothing to that. I don't even know what the fluid level was in the trans when we did that swap. I just took the motor out, we made the mods, I put it back in, and we drove it away. So I'm Richard Holder. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell. I'll keep testing.